welcome to the 11th episode of Reinventing School. We are very happy to go in a different direction today. Typically, as people who watch this regularly know, we have 3 adult professionals who are well-versed in some aspect of the education, business or industry or theory or similar, and then we have 2 students. This time, we actually have 2 professionals, one a professor and one who works for a nonprofit, I think, if I have that about right, but we'll be talking about an economist. And the subject today is, well, we want to get a sense of what does the global education industry look like? And I wrote something some time ago that I'd like to read just to get us started. It's about Haley. She's 7 years old. At the time I wrote it, she was a 2nd grader. Her teacher is Mrs. Mangold. Once a week, Haley goes to Mrs. Aubuchon's room for art, to the gym for Mr. Johnson's physical education class, to the music room to learn flute for Mrs. Lutz, and to library class with Mrs. Adams. In Haley's school, there are 2 2nd grade classes, each one with about 20 students. In total, her K through 6 school serves about 330 students and employs about 46 teachers, 1 principal, 36 professional support staffers, and 6 more in building maintenance. In other words, about 100 adults work in Haley's school. Now, Haley knows that there are more students, more teachers, more staff in other schools. In her school district, 11,000 students and 1,400 professionals. And we could project that out to in her county, in her state, and all that. But I kind of went a little further. I did whatever research the web would allow. And I found that about 1.3 billion students are enrolled in primary and secondary school, and about 65 million teachers, with about 20 million more projected to staff new classrooms, because we're still building new classrooms in new schools. And if we figure maybe 1 non-teaching employee for each teaching employee, that's another 40 million people that we're going to be hiring. So it's a gigantic industry. And even if my numbers aren't even close to right, and we'll know that in a minute, it seems to me that we ought to get a sense of the wholeness of this as well as the segments of it. It's very difficult to do that if you're sitting in an individual school building, and even more confusing if you're sitting in a school building in this year, because those school buildings may or may not be open. There may be different numbers of people. The rules may be different. So we have a lot of confusion. But what I'd like to start with is last year, I guess, when things were still normal, what does it look like? So with that, let me introduce Jonathan and Jean-Marc. And what I have learned is that my trying to introduce a professional who has a complicated resume is foolish. So Jean-Marc, why don't you begin? Just tell us about you and where you work and what you do and what your passions are and all that, and then we'll do the same with Jonathan.
Sure. So let's see. I'm living in Washington, D.C. right now. I am French. You may hear that in my voice, little accent. I'm an education economist. I work at the Global Partnership for Education.
What is the Global Partnership for Education?
So the Global Partnership for Education is an institution, an international organization that provides support to developing countries to develop and implement their national policies. The poorest countries in the world, low-income countries and low-middle-income countries are eligible and members of the partnership, most of them. So it's a very policy-oriented approach. So we have funding. So Global Partnership is also a global fund, but it's a partnership. So a way of working that is a bit specific and articulated around the national policies.
Good. That's a good start. Thank you. Let me jump over to Jonathan. And I know you're with the University of Pennsylvania at the Graduate School of Education, and you've been there for about 20 years. But give us a sense of what that place is all about, why Graduate School of Education matters, and something about your background and where you are.
Well, thank you, Howard, and it's great to be here. Jean-Marc, great to meet you too. So I am a professor of education policy and leadership, and I'm also the chair of the education policy department, but I also run a center called the Consortium for Policy Research and Education. And CPRE is an affiliation of ed policy researchers from around the country, and we look at state, local, district, school policy issues, mostly in the United States, but a little bit internationally.
This is going to sound like a silly question, but I'll ask it anyway. If I'm Haley and I'm 7 years old and you say education policy to me, I'm going to think maybe like somebody has insurance. No context at all. Right?
So what's the difference between like Geico and and a school of education? So what we do is we look at the, so in the US in particular, there's a system of federalism, and federalism is this loose connection between federal education policies, which are mostly either requirements or funding streams, state policies, which tend to be focused around requirements for schools, around guidance, around funding from states to schools, around accountability for school performance, and local systems where really a lot of the decisions are made, and a lot of the systems are set up by which schools need to operate in certain ways or have certain constraints on them. So policy is really the systems that are set up to surround and enable or constrain the actions of teachers and school leaders. And
is the setup that is in the United States, again, this may be a very naive question, is it similar in most other countries? And if, in other words, if I went to England, would I find national and county, I guess, would be the, whatever the right, yeah, counties, right? Mm-hmm. Or would it be a different setup?
Well, Jean-Marc, this is a setup for you, because if you talk about the French education system and its contrast to the American education system, quite different. So let me pass that over to you a bit.
Thank you. Yeah, on also beyond France, but yeah, the federal system in the US is quite different from many other systems that will be more centralized, but will be quite similar to other federal systems. So federal systems are very specific with, as Jonathan described, a kind of more or less loose connection between the different level of the system, the federal, or let's say the national level, on the more regional level. But you have other systems that are much more centralized with a much more tighter control on the system. So that's kind of the two kind of system we see across the world. They function quite differently. And if you look at how they perform, well, it really depends. You can have a very effective federal system, or you can have a very ineffective federal system, and you can have very effective centralized system, you can have very inefficient centralized system. So that's the way systems are organized are often the products of the history of the countries. And that's interesting and fascinating to look at this diversity. And when you are an education specialist on analyzing this system and trying to understand how they work before talking about policy, that's something you need to look at where they are coming from.
So, and Howard, one thing that, it was Lucy, right? She was the student you were referring to?
I got to look here for a second. It was Haley.
Haley, I'm sorry, yeah. Haley. So one thing that Haley would probably learn in social studies or her history class is that in the US, they have a pretty distinct system where things that are not prescribed to the federal government are devolved to local control. And so I think standards are a good way to distinguish this. And so certainly in Europe, and Jean-Marc, I'm gonna defer to you for Africa and for other continents, but there are, in most European countries, there's a very, very high level of centralization. And in the US, we have a long tradition of local control. And Haley would know that.
Yeah, and if you want a concrete example, for example, in centralized countries like in Europe or Africa, schools start at the same date everywhere. So it's a very simple way. Same day, everybody is going to school. Same day, everywhere in the country, which sometimes doesn't make much sense because of the difference of climate, etc. But that's a very concrete example. Same day, same curriculum, it's very standardized.
So this explains why in doing Kids on Earth, I go around the world and interview kids. And I was in Montevideo in Uruguay. And they had to get the school had to get permission from the National Ministry of Education in order for me to be able to enter the school. And I'm thinking, boy, that'd be like my going to a small town in upstate New York and having to go to the White House for a document. I was like, wow, this is so different. But that's an example of what you mean.
Absolutely, yeah. It's not rare. You will find that in many countries, particularly if you are a foreigner, an external expert, a journalist coming in the country, not someone from the education system of the country. You will definitively need authorization at the central level to get to the school. Yeah.
Fascinating. So the commonalities, though, probably outshine the differences. There are 20, 30, maybe 40 kids in a room. There's going to be some form of blackboards or something similar wrapping around a wall or two. There's going to be a teacher out front. The kids are going to be sitting in clusters or in rows or something like that. They're going to have some form of homework. The curriculum, at least in the schools I've been in, looks more similar than different. And they're all going to have Chromebooks. Am I seeing through eyes that are seeing the right thing?
No, I think you're right. I had the opportunity to visit some schools that unfortunately didn't look like that, but which is probably not a good sign. So, in Africa, I had the opportunity to visit schools that were outside, under a tree. I visited a school, it was in Guinea-Bissau. There was only one wall. So the blackboard was on the wall, but that's the only wall in there was one wall, and there was no roof, nothing. So just to say that, unfortunately, in certain contexts, you don't have this classic setting, but this classic setting, yes, is true in 90% of the schools in the world. You will find this situation. Also, the way teachers are teaching may be quite different.
I'm sorry, say that again.
The way teachers are teaching is often quite different.
How so?
Well, you will find some very frontal approach where teachers kind of tell the lessons with very little interaction with children. So that's something that is quite frequent in some contexts. And in other contexts, you will have much more interaction, group work, something that is much more socializing on the kind of social learning, well organized with a lot of interaction. So what's happening in the classroom, even if the setting seems similar, may be quite different in my experience, which also translates by different level of learning.
So we're in an interesting era in the United States, and I would think in some other countries as well, where we're going to have to rethink what our configuration looks like. When you're talking about meeting under a tree, I'm thinking, I've heard my school board suggest that, I think. I mean, the scale of change and the difference between what the United States has traditionally done and what we will be doing. How do we learn from other countries? What are there specific ideas that you're like, yeah, we're going to end up looking a lot more like that in the next year if we're unable to use our school buildings as we have in the past?
Well, I think that it might be more that that necessity is the mother of invention here, and that the standard approaches that you talked about having a room where kids go and they sit in rows and desks and the teacher's in front and they're doing didactic teaching. If you have a online learning experience because schools are shut, and many districts in the US right now have already decided that they're going to go to an online model. I think that Los Angeles decided this, and San Diego before that, and several large districts have said they're going to start online. Jean-Marc mentioned that in, where was it in Jean-Marc, where they're going to stop school for a year?
In Kenya.
In Kenya, wow. Okay, so that's a very extreme notion. But going back to your point, Howard, that these new, so in the best of worlds, there might be kids might be going to a physical building, but the experience is going to have to look very different to both social distance and to attend to the health of teachers and of kids, and also in hybrid models where online learning is going to take place. These are going to foster, I think, big changes in how we think about the instructional experience of kids. And so I don't know, I'm sure that there will be learning across nations, but this is a shared pandemic and a shared problem. And I'm sure that seeking some kind of effective response is going to foster all kinds of experimentation, which is very exciting, but daunting.
Yeah, well, and I want to talk about some of those models in a second, but I want to come back to Haley for a second and my expansion of Haley's world to a global world. Are my numbers close? 1.3 billion K through 12 students in the world, is that about right?
Yep.
And it seems to me there's probably about 2 billion if we take 2 billion kids, maybe 2.5 billion kids if we go 0 to 18. And I've worked hard to figure out those numbers. They are not easy to find because the stats seem to be related to the number of kids who are not in school. But to find the number of kids who are in school seems to take more work. We seem to have a very sort of negative look, at least from the websites that I've been able to get at, and your sources may be better. And it seems to me also that we would have more and more teachers because we're educating more and more girls, particularly in the global south. And if we're doing that, we're going to need more of everything, whether it's teachers or support or classrooms or anything else. So this becomes an industry that grows and grows for the next 20 or 30 years. And from my perspective, it looks like the jobs that we are training them to do will end up being teachers to a great extent, because you want to be close to family and village or neighborhood. So it looks as though this is a strange system that ends up promoting more and more female involvement at the teacher level, except perhaps in Africa or in certain parts of Africa, where I think we have more of a male teaching tradition, but that may also be changing. So that's what I'm gathering by reading and by talking about doing some visiting. How close am I to right? Or how wrong am I?
No, I think that's a fair point. No, it also really depends on how the education system are going to evolve, right? The model you are talking about is the current model we know and we have known for a while. It's coming from the Industrial Revolution with one teacher in the classroom. What we are seeing now, because of the situation with COVID, is alternate model of education where kids are doing distance learning quite a lot. And because of the ongoing threats of the virus, this is not going to go away. So for a while, at least, countries will need to kind of reinvent the way they are delivering education on keeping their kids safe. So you can have the decision of closing the school for 1 year, like Kenya. It's an extreme decision, but we see other countries going for alternate schooling. So one day, part of the children are going to school to ensure that there's enough space for physical distancing. On the other day, it's the other part of the children. And then when children are not in school, they have to learn. So you can have this blended approach that can be configured differently in different contexts. So I think there's already a lot of experimentation how education can be further developed or deliver differently than the model we know. And just to put things in perspective, in low-income countries, low middle-income countries, and sub-Saharan Africa, for example, if you have to recruit all the teachers you need for secondary education and build all the high schools you will need to deliver the current model of education we know in Europe and North America, it will take several decades.
It would take, say that again?
Several decades.
Okay.
so if the model is the one we have right now, we won't get to universal secondary education in these countries before a long time.
Before 2100 is what you're saying.
More or less, without talking about the quality of the learning, right? Just the infrastructure and getting the kids in an education model that is right now. So I think what is happening at the moment because of COVID is probably going to bring some new idea or help change the mindset of people about, there's maybe also a way to deliver education effectively, particularly if you are looking at older children, youth, that can be a little bit more autonomous. So I think that's a very interesting moment where we are already seeing a lot of experimentation I would expect that some of them will be quite fruitful and may give ideas on a new way to do education in the future, particularly in countries where resources will not allow them to get to where they want to go in expanding education for all children.
Mind-bending. We're going to take a break. We're going to come back in about a minute, but I want to point everybody towards next week's episode, which will actually look at the other side of what you just said. What do kids want from school? What do they expect? What is reasonable? And how might they reinvent things? And that'll be a conversation with kids, but I'll be the only adult. We'll be right back. So there's a degree, as we talk about education policy, and you guys have done a good job of explaining what that is. Here's what I wonder about. If we were to break down the system so that we have parents, students, teachers, administration, so the operational part of it, and the community, which might include government and the like, I started looking at where the flexibility might be in those systems. So it's fascinating because it's shifting. If Jean-Marc, what you said it kind of runs true. With parents, if we begin there, they're not going to become teachers. They're not suddenly going to change. They have to earn a living. They may not be all that good or all that interested in educating their own children. There's a reason why we've developed this massive outsourcing system all over the world for a combination of daycare and some form of learning. The students, I don't think, care that much what they learn as long as their curiosity is being satisfied and they feel as though they're being trained in a direction. A lot of flexibility. Teachers, I think a lot of flexibility if they're freed from the restrictions that the federal system or others require, because there's an evaluation system and all of this that's becoming increasingly difficult to manage and perhaps somewhat irrelevant. When we jump into school administration, I got to say, I think their main concern is going to be disinfecting surfaces. I just can't imagine, with all of this pressure on keeping people healthy and keeping school moving, that they will be able to manage a clever new approach or experimentation at a scale, at any kind of scale. When you go into the land of higher level community, boy, that's complicated because it's difficult to know whether we're talking about my neighborhood community or the nation and what society needs. And then you've got a lot of political issues as well. So I think the pivot point is probably going to end up being not the administration that has to kind of move in a new direction. I think it's going to be the student-teacher relationship led by the student, because the student has been given all of this control now, both the idea of freedom. I can choose my own gender, for example, but I can also choose what I want to learn. And if I'm not stuck with an old system, the likelihood that I'm going to find something interesting to do, I think, increases. that puts the teacher into a really strange position, because either they can support a system that isn't working very well, or they can work with the individual student, or some blend like that. But as the students become more empowered, I think individualized education becomes much more of a reality. And I have no idea how that bumps into the idea of a federal education policy or anything remotely like it. It's not the way I learn. It's probably not the way you guys learn. I learn about things I'm interested in. The idea that somebody's going to teach me without my going, can you please teach me? I want to learn, I don't think is a functional human concept. But, but having said that, next time I go to my dentist, I really want to be wrong. So what do you guys think about any of that? And again, I'm coming into this knowing a lot less than you guys do, but sometimes that allows me to place a question on the floor that typically wouldn't be asked.
So let me start out here, and Jean-Marc can jump in as he has things to add. So one thing that we've seen quite a bit over the history of education, at least in the United States, is this pendulum that swings back and forth between centralized top-down approaches and localized bottom-up approaches. And we very much are now in a local control approach. Our federal education policy right now, with the Every Student Succeeds Act, is really allowing lots of local flexibility to let districts and schools determine how they're going to approach teaching and learning. And one of the, we're leaving an era of heavy accountability where we were really focusing on the same set of outcomes, the same set of tests for all schools, and that really drove a lot of similarity in the way that schools approach things. But one of the things that you've brought out, Howard, which is really fascinating, is that the system of schooling is not in alignment with contemporary theories about how kids learn, right? So when you described your inquiry approach to learning, how you followed your passions and identified things that you were curious about and explored those things, that's a sociocultural or constructivist way of building your own understanding. But that is very different than the traditional models of, we just painted this picture, and you painted this picture, Howard, of schools as being places where kids are in rows and the teacher is, like pouring knowledge into their heads, right? And that's an old, outdated notion of learning, but the systems are constructed around that outdated notion. And it's not in alignment with the more recent ways that we're understanding how kids really learn to have deeper understanding of things, not just superficial procedural understandings of things. So we're in this moment of flux, and it's very possible to be optimistic that the COVID experience is going to really force that shift a lot more rapidly than it was happening previously. Let's
play that out.
Yeah, sure.
Play that out. So it's now July. We're recording the show in the middle of July. I'm going to bet, and if anybody wants to take the other side of the bet, it's fine, that we will not have anything resembling a regular school schedule for the remainder of 2020. And we probably won't have it at least through the first few months of 2021. In the US, there's an election coming up. If the election goes Republican, that period will probably extend much longer because the pandemic will continue. The pandemic's numbers are likely to continue on the pattern they've been. But if the election goes Democratic, among the priorities will be, we have to figure out how to lessen the number of cases in the pandemic, lessen all that, and we have to figure out school. But even figuring out school, after having it been sort of much less of a factor for at least 6 months, but really for a year. At that point, if I'm a 10-year-old kid, I found things I'm interested in because I have time. I never had time before. Now school takes me 2 or 3 hours, or I'm blowing off the idea of distance learning entirely because it's not working in my house, the connection doesn't work, it's too noisy, whatever it is. So I found my passions. I'm not being tested. So, and my parents are like, as long as you're doing something and you're learning, that's great. So now you're going to bring me back into a classroom environment in September of 2021, and I'm going to look at the teacher going, why are we doing this? Now, I'm going to try really hard to behave, but I'm 11, and on my best day, I'm not going to be able to sit there for a certain number of hours. At the same time, this distance learning thing has fallen apart because it just is a different experience. And given the choice of watching distance learning or watching a bunch of YouTube videos on something I'm interested in, I'm picking the YouTube videos. And then I discovered that I can get books, or I can talk to other people, or I'm being enabled to talk to other adults or other kids who are interested in, for example, particle physics, which is I ran into a kid in Slovenia, and he comes in with an Einstein playing electric guitar t-shirt. And we end up, I'm talking about quantum theory with a kid who's 11, 12 years old. I think he was maybe 13 years old. And he's like, I'm going to be a theoretical physicist in an Eastern European university. I know where I'm going. Sometimes I teach science class because nobody in the school knows what I'm talking about. How did you learn? I watched 72 YouTube videos. I watched all of them. And occasionally I got in touch with somebody. If he can do it, he's a smart kid. He's not a brilliant kid. I mean, he's certainly, high up there. Other kids who are equally smart or equally motivated, wouldn't they do the same thing? And I'm not saying the whole system is going to fall apart, but if you have the opportunity, wouldn't you follow your curiosity? Or am I just hoping for the best for a very small percentage of people?
Jean-Marc?
Yeah, no, I think that's maybe you're hoping for the best. I do think that's a scenario that will apply to some of the kids without question. I do think also that a lot of kids want to go back to school. I know that one of my kids wants to go back to school to get to his friends, and he's also a social learner. Without other kids, other friends around him to learn, he has a hard time to motivate himself to learn. So that's just to say that there are several categories of children that react differently to the current situation. And one category of children we need not to forget at that stage. Schools education is also a protection for a lot of children who live in difficult environments. In the countries where my organization is working, they benefit from school feeding programs. They benefit from many other aspects when they go to school. So it's not only about learning. It's also an equity dimension. So the case you were describing, Howard, is a kind of the nice case we would like to see for everyone. But we have a lot of equity issues that have been unfortunately getting worse during this pandemic in developed countries, but also in developing countries. The kids who are not going to go back to school, who are not learning, are generally the poorest kids or from marginalized community. So we have also this challenge that is there that we should not forget. There's an equity challenge that is really important to consider. One additional point on what you are saying about the children and the kids that will want something different, and I think that's probably true, but I think also the parents are really important. Sometimes the parents are very conservative. They want a good education is the education they get. So we have an idea of what is a good education that is based on the education we got or we imagine, which is not necessarily what children in the 21st century really need to thrive. So during this last month, the parents has been confronted to this new situation, and as you said, education has been outsourced. Right, and what we have is schooling system, not education system. But with parents getting much more involved, at least for those who are able to do that, you have a lot of questions about, are my kids really learning things that are meaningful? Is that the right way to for them to learn the best thing. So for example, my children have been looking at some of the websites to learn some of the things they were supposed to learn in school, because it was much better delivered. There was video or YouTube, etc. So you can learn. If you look for it, you can learn other things. And parents are also realizing that, oh, that's also something that is quite interesting. And I think that's also, when we're talking about mindset shift, it's not only for policymakers, it's also for parents, realizing that it's about time to think about education a little bit differently than we were doing in the 20th century.
Let's separate this out. Let's assume, I agree with you, of course, I probably all of us agree, that there are equity issues that have to be talked about, and we will talk about that. But if you don't have a school building to go to, much as anybody wants to be in that school building, it's not safe to go into that school building, so we're not going into the school building. And even if you do, the teachers are going to look at this going, I'm not going to the school building, and I'm certainly not going to be in a room with a bunch of germ spreaders. So I think we have to look at these issues sort of a little more structurally. If there isn't school, but there is 50, 60, 70% ability to access internet, and some portion of being able to access other things like books, other resources, or go out in the woods, or go into the neighborhood, or whatever it is. I'm going to guess that roughly half of students, at least in the US, have some form of that access. Now, it's a third, it's a half, whatever it is. If they don't go to school for a year, their behavior changes. If the teachers aren't in the building for a year, after really trying hard to do a noble effort on remote learning, their behavior is going to change too. Their framework for what kids need to know and how they do it, it just begins to erode the idea of a classic formal education. Let's look at those people first, and then let's go to the equity issue. We'll do that after the break. But how do you think about the idea of a common curriculum of any kind, of everybody's going to learn quadratic equations when most people don't want to learn quadratic equations? Right now, I'm in a mode where I don't have to learn it, so I'm not going to do it. I'd much rather dig deep into marine biology because I'm really interested in fish or dinosaurs or whatever it is. So, if I'm in 4th grade and I'm a boy, I want to learn a lot about dinosaurs. Jonathan?
Well, I think that what you're describing is a particular model of a philosophy of education, which is really the notion that you use the interest of the child as the entry point into a broad variety of subject area knowledge, right? So, if you're interested in dinosaurs, we can get into mathematics by studying, the dimensions of dinosaurs and the fact that, some of them were monstrous sized and some were microscopic. And, we can use your interest to get into a whole bunch of what we would think of as more standard educational fare, right? So that's a particular approach to learning, which I think is very attractive.
Is that a US approach? Is that a British approach? Is that a Finnish approach? Is that tied in any way to the way people learn in different places? Or is this just my own little crazy fantasy?
I think it's a philosophy of learning. I don't know that it is particularly, associated with any particular culture more than others. I think it's probably a minority view, but certainly in many traditional schooling systems, it's not what the student is interested in. It's what the adults are interested in teaching kids.
Why?
Well, there's a lot of debate about that, but one could be, what's the real purpose of schooling? Well, part of it is trying to teach authority and control to kids, right? That's a very traditional notion of the underlying implicit purpose of schooling.
Still?
Yes, still.
Everywhere. I mean, if I go to a
I'm
very
sure you
liberal
would
country,
see that in France, for example. I'm sure you would see it in many African countries. Jean-Marc, you can chime in here about your experience in other places, but I think that notion of the starting, making it adult-centered as opposed to student-centered is probably a predominant conception across the world, I would dare say.
Yeah, I think part of that also is, yeah, you're right, there's a discipline aspect to it, but there's also this idea that there's a need to provide a certain kind of education for the citizen and the worker we want. So it has mainly been driven by the public sphere and the private sphere, the firms. What kind of skills do we need? So it's not for people to choose what they want to learn, which is not necessarily a good thing. So totally agree on that. And I agree also it's not attached to certain countries. It's more philosophies that you will find in different places. But to come back to your point, Howard, about the parents, the students, and the teachers are going through these changes and for quite a while, because we are not yet there. We are not yet we are not in a post-COVID world. We are in the COVID world, and we are going to stay here, unfortunately, for a while. This is changing the way of people operating. On what you are describing, Howard, in my view, is certainly not a majority, but it could be a key driver in changes in education system and mindsets. So that's something that is, that's an assumption. But I do think that if parents, teachers, and students from a significant minority start questioning and start perceiving the elements you were mentioning about, let's have more individualized learning, let's look at the interest of the kids, etc. That can help shift the way education is approached and delivered. So that's interesting to see if these people, this group, will be drivers of change. Let's put it that way.
So one way to think about this, Howard, is to say, what is the biggest predictor of how teachers teach? Right, and what do you think?
Being paid.
The biggest predictor of how teachers teach is how they were taught.
Well, I would think it's, my boss told me to do this job this way, and they're paying me, so I have to do what she said. No? I mean, am I being naive?
Well, there's a fair amount of autonomy within the classroom, but of course it's structured around that. But if you think about the way that, if you think that a huge influence on the way teachers teach is how they were taught, you hear parents all the time saying that, I learned it this way, and so why aren't you teaching it that way, right? Which is the same phenomenon. And so there's this interesting evolution in adult professional development, which I think is gonna, in the medium term, start filtering down into the way that teachers start to interact with kids. So these are slower movements, but I think that the changes that you're indicating and the preferences about how you personally learn are starting to become more and more, albeit slowly, more and more widespread throughout our system. And they're being driven by, again, this realignment between more modern notions of how people learn and older notions of how people learn. And that those are being filtered first through professional development of teachers, which is subtly shifting their ways of teaching. And then that, I expect, will continue to shift towards students as they become teachers. I'm
so curious how this is going to play out in the two places in Africa where I've interviewed kids, Ghana and Uganda. We'll start there. When we come back, we'll do a quick break. Jonathan, you said that before the break that many teachers teach in ways that they were taught. But Jean-Marc, if I'm a student in a school in Ghana, and I forget the name of the city, but we had a bunch of interviews on Kids on Earth that we conducted in a classroom. The teacher was, I believe, Teacher of the Year in Ghana, and the government bought her a pickup truck, which is kind of cool. The kids in the classroom are first generation. Their parents didn't go. Certainly, mom didn't go. So I'm not sure how that system works in a place where education is still newer, or if they're coming out of a period where they haven't had the independence, they haven't had the ability to think freely. They've basically just taken a system that was there before, done the best they can. Even those kids now, when I talk to them one-on-one, they have a great deal of respect for the teacher and for the process, but they also spend a lot of time learning on their own and not necessarily using a computer to do it. So Jean-Marc, what happens in places that we don't see quite so much in the media? How does this individual learning thing work, or is it way better to just follow the traditions because they've worked for so long?
Well, as you mentioned, it really depends on the teacher you have, right? So if you have the teacher of the year, you may have a teacher that is approaching education in a way that is very close to what you are describing, trying to get the curiosity of the kids at stake, engaging them, having projects, etc. Great teachers are everywhere. And if you get one of these teachers, even if you're in a remote rural areas, and I saw that with my eyes, you get world-class education. So it's not about where you are, it's about your teacher. And of course, there's also something that is quite important. There's a lot of emphasis on social skills, right? Right now, we talk about this social-emotional skill, etc. And that's something I observe in Africa. That's something kids learn a lot out of school. That's part of the education they get out of school. So it's a cultural environment. So they also have this social learning on the way they are able to interact. The fact that generally they speak several languages, even young, that's multilingual people are quite frequent in Africa. So it's a very different environment. Learning is happening all the time. It's not learning or not learning. So we don't measure social emotional skills very well. So at the moment, what we measure is literacy. And unfortunately, we know that there's a big learning crisis, even before COVID, what we were facing. If you think about low middle income countries, so a country like Ghana, more than half of the children, 53%, age 10, are not able to read a simple sentence, right? So if you look at the big picture, you have this huge learning crisis where children are not learning the basics reading. So it's a mixed picture. In these countries, you find classroom and schools where you have a world-class education. Unfortunately, in most of the schools, there's very little learning happening inside the school. So that's this kind of contrast that is quite characteristic of developing countries.
So the way development, or I just found the videos. I just looked on the Vimeo site for Kids on Earth. The title of the piece, it's in Kumasi in Ghana, which is I think the second largest city, if I have that right, or the third. And the title of one of the videos is "Mom is a seamstress, Dad is a butcher, and I will be a doctor." So we go back to the John Adams quote in our country. So there is a progress. There's the Hans Rosling, we're going to bring health and wealth together, and they tend to be very closely linked as we make progress. On one, we make progress on the other, we live longer and all this. I'm finding that no matter where I go, even if it's a poor village, the kids seem to be different from what my expectations were. They are more whole. They're more clear on where they're going. They're more clear how they're going to get there. They can describe how to become a pharmacologist. And you look at her and she's 7 years old. I'm not sure I knew what a pharmacologist was last year. She's 7. So, and I don't think that's happening because of the internet. And I do think it's happening because of exposure to other kids. But if everybody is poor, how is that happening? Is it magic?
No, it's not magic. And if you look at the international survey asking people what's their top priority, education always come number one. That was not always true. We saw that turn in terms of priority education becoming the most important thing for people around 2000. Before that, there was still a lot of resistance in some countries to send kids in school. And we have this shift at one stage where everybody realized that education is the way to success, is the way to better income, health, etc. I think one thing that didn't change across the year is the thirst for learning of kids. They are curious. They want to learn, even if they don't frame it that way. That's something I saw everywhere I went. Curiosity, interest in learning new things. It's characteristic of kids all around the world. So I think that's really the kind of basic element you build on when you think about your education in contexts that have nothing to do with the US or Europe.
Pick a place you've been to, preferably Global South, and give us a portrait of what it's like now and the changes you've seen. And if you can, some of the statistics that go around that.
So what has been changing, I started my career in 95. There was still a lot of children out of school, right? Not going to school, and in certain community, they didn't want to send their kids in school.
Why not? Why not?
Because they didn't think that was useful. And sometimes there was cultural reason. Sometimes it was just, we need the kids to help us to work in the field or in the shop. So the benefits of education was not always as obvious as it is today. So that's really something that is quite different during the 20 years plus of my career. That's something I saw changing radically in terms of very few places now where there's resistance to education. There's still some. That's not.
Give us a sense of, pick a place and tell us what you saw and how it changed and why it changed.
Well, if you take a village,
give me one that you visited. I know. Or
I will lose the names. I visited a school. I don't know if it was a village. I think the school was between villages in Central African Republic a few years ago. And I didn't see this place, and it was just after the conflict in the country. And what I saw is that a lot of children, so my organization financed the construction of this school with partners on the government, of course, and we visited the school. And the fact that you're in a small, rural, poor area, 2 or 3 hours driving from the capital, Bangui, and you have every single kid in the area of the school who is in the school. That's something that is not new, but that's not something that was always the case by the past. So I saw that interest, that willingness to go to school, that I think that's what makes a big difference. Of course, a lot of people are saying one of the risks is that as a lot of schools in this context, fragile context, low-income countries, they do not deliver on learning. The kids are not learning as much. There's a risk that people get, frustrated and do not want to send their kids to school anymore. So that's a risk.
Why not? How did they suddenly end up in the school? Like at some point, a parent made a decision or a community made a decision that the kids will go to school. And then you're describing a situation where they're going, yeah, maybe not. So what caused them to suddenly want to put their kids in school after centuries of not having their kids in school? Was it a law? Was it a desire? Was there a really pretty teacher? Like, what was the reason why they were in school?
I think that as it's something we saw across the world, right? Across the continent, in Africa and other places, it's pure rationality, right? People notice that those who went to school and learn got better job, got better life. I think that as simple as that, the benefit of education, became very visible to everyone, which was not the case when a minority was getting education, on just getting education was for a minority. Then people realized that everybody can get an education, everybody can get a better life. That's something that has been becoming visible for everyone, poor or rich. So a lot of hope has been put into education because people have just seen that, oh, the children of the neighbors, they just went to high school and got this job at the city, and that's great. He can help his parents. That's a kind of basic life fact that have been driving a lot of attention to education.
We've been doing that since the Middle Ages or before, right? I mean, is this new? And why did it take so long to come to the Central African Republic?
Well, it is new in the sense of these countries didn't get mass education before the second part of the 20th century. So for them, it was new, yes. And remember, the colonization history is a pretty bad one, where a lot of children were forced into school in general, the children of the chiefs, of the elite of the country, to get European education to help with administration, but also to facilitate colonization, basically. So that explained a lot of pushback toward an education that was kind of oppression for people. And after the independence, it has been a long process for education to become the education of the people of the countries, rather than the education of foreigners trying to take control of their country. So it's once again, the story is there. It took decades, and then people just saw education for what it was when it became more and more frequent for children to go to education, that it improved lives, and that's a big change.
It's a big change. Jonathan, I'm worried because at some point, the number of people who will get jobs and keep jobs as a result of the education, the chain of events that we've talked about. On my worst days, I think it's falling apart. That this whole great idea of let's put people through an education system so they can make more money and become more productive citizens. How does COVID behave in that environment? How does it affect the way we think about education in the US? And then Jean-Marc, I'm going to ask you the same question about outside the US.
Well, I want to build on something that Jean-Marc was talking about, which I think implicitly was talking about, which is this notion of school solely as a place of education and learning. But we've been doing a study across the US of school principals' responses to the COVID outbreak. And so we've interviewed over 100 principals from about 20 states, ranging from California to Indian reservations in Montana to Minneapolis, both before and after the George Floyd incident, to Oklahoma, Texas, Florida, up the East Coast. And one of the first responses that principals dealt with when school closed was how to get food to kids. Yep. And we have about 56 million kids enrolled in school in the US, and the free and reduced lunch and breakfast programs serve about 30 million of those 56 million. So what I'm saying here, more than half. So the ingenuity that they went to get food out to families was really phenomenal and heartwarming, but also heartbreaking in the sense that school isn't just a place for learning, but it's an extension of all these social support systems. So, you know, safety for kids, social emotional support for kids, food support. These are the very basics of Maslow's hierarchy of need. And schools are serving these purposes that are completely on top of this traditional notion of school as a place of learning. So I just want to say that what this pandemic has really exposed is really the function of school in society is much deeper than we traditionally think of, you know, as a place that you go and you learn math and you learn English and you learn social studies or whatever. That, you know, it's really serving a host of really important needs for the fundamental, you know, needs of kids in our society.
So how do you replace it with distance learning then? That formula doesn't make any sense at all.
Well, you know, there's so we heard stories about schools using the bus routes to drop off food for families. So they would basically, you know, instead of having kids sitting on the bus, they would have packets of food and they would follow the bus route. You know, I think that there's been phenomenal attempts to reach out to kids and make sure that schools knew where kids were and checking in on families and checking in on whether kids were doing okay. So, you know, I think that the role of schools goes way beyond these traditional notions that we're talking about teaching and learning. And, you know, these are unstated things that really have been surfaced, and, you know, they're fairly transparent, except when you have a crisis, and then all of a sudden they become very visible.
But when we're talking about, I have a school board meeting I'll be attending with 2,000 other people online, right, in a couple hours.
Mm-hmm.
They don't talk about that.
Where do you live?
Yeah, I live in
right. What kind of community do you live in, right?
But still, there's a 20% poverty rate.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, when I look on, because now we know all of that because of the Johns Hopkins site, we can check out all of that, right? So certainly schools are evolving, taking the COVID out of it, into we need to play more of a role in the community.
For sure.
And we've seen that happening in Cambodia with the CCF and others. The problem is, I don't think we have a clear picture as a society. Go back to my hierarchy involving school administration and the like. I don't think we quite get, I don't think parents, unless you're in that individual situation where you are getting food or know somebody who's getting food, you think about school primarily as classrooms and curriculum and teachers and students. And it isn't that. It certainly hasn't been that in the places where I visited in Uganda. It just wasn't that. It was much more what you're describing. It was a full community experience, and not only for kids, but sometimes for seniors as well. Mm-hmm. They were providing some form of health care. They were providing microloans. They were providing basic health services, and sometimes a lot more than that. In India, I found that the doctor that I would typically find in a hospital was in a private school, like private school. So it's evolving. Does this, I agree, it's changing our exposure. All of this is becoming a little more evident. But as we're rebuilding this, assuming that we have a gap, are we going to rebuild it with that as part of, will feeding kids become part of education policy studies? What's the most efficient logistical plan for feeding most of the kids in the United States or most of the kids in the world? Is that part of what you think about? Is that part of the domain of the Graduate School of Education in one of the world's great universities? Do you talk about that?
Absolutely. There's all kinds of data systems that are connecting increasingly social service supports and school systems. So there's all kinds of tightening between the medical system, between the psychological systems, between the the police and the judicial systems to schools. And so I think that we're going to see more and more seamless connections between schools as a wraparound service, not just as an educational institution.
Then my numbers that I quoted at the beginning of this episode are very wrong, because I'm very low, because I'm not counting additional medical staff, and I'm not counting additional food services staff, and social emotional staff. This becomes a larger and larger industry, maybe the largest industry on earth, with an outpost in almost every community.
I think that's
a
right.
way to think about school. And yet, we may not be able to go to those places. So, Jean-Marc, how do we skew this thinking in places that you are more familiar with, and frankly, I'm less familiar with? How wrong are we? Or how right are we? Or is it even greater extent?
I think it's in a greater extent. The social role of school is really similar, but you have more extreme situation. So one of the consequences of the COVID-19 virus is a big economic crisis, right? And the consequence of this crisis is that between 70 to 100 million people are pushed in extreme poverty. And a lot of them are children. So when you think about these numbers, and that's the first time the reduction of poverty has been the great story of success in development for the last decade. That's really progress have been there. For the first time, it's going up on a big way. On all these children in extreme poverty, of course, the first thing they will face is food insecurity, malnutrition. The most powerful or effective system in low-income countries, low-middle-income countries, that is present in each community, as you were describing, that's schools. So if you don't use schools for providing food and other kind of support, health support, and etc., in the midst of this kind of crisis, that is the twin crisis, health and economy, you are going to miss the point on see a disaster in terms of impact in your communities. That's quite obvious, and we have a lot of studies, by the way, showing that school feeding program or other financial incentive like cash transfer are very effective to bring the poorest to school, because of course parents don't have to find the resources to feed their kids. So that's something that is also backed by research. That's very effective to get the kids to school. So at the moment, estimates, every week we have new estimates, but we're talking about maybe 7 to 10 million more kids who will not go back to school, so out of school. That we never saw that before. Okay, we have been making progress for 20, 30 years in this area. If we don't look at education beyond the learning function, but as schools as a more broader social function with health and nutrition as part of it, I'm concerned about the impact that we could see in the poorest countries in the world. That's a big risk.
Okay, we have, there's so much more that I want to talk to you guys about, but we try our best to stay within an hour. So we're going to wrap this up. We're going to roll credits, but if you guys can hang out for another minute or two when we're finished, I have a feeling we'll continue. And some of that can be seen on from our YouTube viewers as well. So Michael, if you would, roll the end credit, and then we'll continue the conversation informally. Thank you.
For on-demand episodes and more, visit our website. Kids on Earth contains hundreds of video interviews with students from around the world. Learning Revolution is a global collaboration network for people who care about learning. Be sure to join us next Thursday for a new episode of Reinventing School. Thanks for watching.